Cancel the election and the dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with the Mark and the Millennials. And the Millennial joining me today is Garrick Ross.
Happy Friday, America.
Happy Friday. And of course, our producer, Adam Couture, our assistant producer, Christopher Hopkins. And we also have our guest, Stephen is here. Thank you, Stephen, for being here. He's just observing and listening, so we're not going to hear from him, although he can say something in the background. You can probably hear it because the microphones will pick it up with no problem. This podcast is called Cancel the Election, and you won't believe what just happened. You won't believe it. So,
I don't
Congressman,
believe half of what happens these days, Mark.
especially these days.
Jeez.
Congressman Louis Gohmert, Republican, Texas,
Yes.
introduced a bill that is the ultimate cancel culture bill.
Yeah.
You won't believe this.
It's about logic. Logical conclusions.
His bill basically cancels the name Democrat Party because, not Democratic, because Democratic is a description of a political system. It's really called the Democrat Party. A lot of people make that mistake. And he's canceling the name Democrat Party because it was the party of slavery.
And Jim Crow and segregation.
And all the bad stuff that happened, right?
Yes.
Pre-Lincoln as well as post-Lincoln.
Yes.
And so his bill, Louis Gohmert, Republican, Texas, this is brilliant. He's basically saying, look, Nancy Pelosi took down 4 portraits of 4 speakers of the House.
All were Democrats.
Recently, because they were all members of the Confederacy.
Yes.
And either owned slaves or supported slavery. And she took down the portraits, but they were all Democrats.
Yes.
So she took down the portraits of Democrats, but she's a Democrat. She's part of that problem. If she really believes in the cancel culture that she's talking about, then let's cancel the Democrat Party. That is basically Louis Gohmert's bill.
Make them change their name.
We have a clip on this. We're going to discuss it shortly, and here is the clip.
That any political organization or party that has ever held a public position that supported slavery or the Confederacy shall either change its name or be barred from participation in the House of Representatives.
So there you go, that any political party that participated in slavery in any way cannot participate in the debate or in the House of Representatives. That would be the Democrat Party.
Yeah. So let's think what is the purpose of this bill? Some people might see this as like a screw the Democrats, but really this is just following their own, logic to its inevitable conclusion. Steadily we're seeing in America canceling, cancel culture and the tacky phrase that it is, but we're seeing it with any statue, any memorial, any phrase, anthem, flag, that stands for anything that people don't like or that has any vestiges in, American history, that has to be taken down. It has to be, put away. It has to be changed. And so, this is effectively saying, we want to do it with all these things, but let's take a look in the mirror at one of the political parties that was a prominent supporter of all of these things that we want to cancel. And so we have to cancel it too. Otherwise, from Louis Gohmert's perspective, you're not following, you're not doing all the things that you should be doing then, because this is what cancel culture does. It just keeps going and going and going. It
never ends.
And it never ends.
And so Gohmert's his resolution says, in part, resolved that the Speaker of the House of Representatives, that would be Nancy Pelosi, shall remove any item that named, symbolizes, or mentions any political organization or party that has ever held a public position that supported slavery or the Confederacy from any area within the House wing of the Capitol or any House building, and shall donate such item or symbol to the Library of Congress, Gohmert said. And 2, that any political organization or party that has ever held a public position that supported slavery or the Confederacy shall either change its name or be barred from participation in the House of Representatives. With that, Madam Speaker, I yield back my time.
That was good stuff.
It doesn't get any better than that. I mean, talk about, this is the problem, right? The party of hypocrisy. The party that's out there talking about, it's the party of anarchy, the party of the Confederacy, the party of, and look, there's an article that's out there now that I read recently, and it's called, Modern Day Slavery, talking about how the Democrat Party is enslaving the black communities in the inner cities because of the lack of school choice, which we talked about many times on this program. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, so first of all, I just see this party and this movement as, promises they can't keep, or, writing checks they can't cash. And it's, and it's pretty typical. You see these politicians and they make these promises, we're gonna change history to reflect the diversity of the country, and we're gonna take down, monuments and statues that are triggering or cause public harm, and we're gonna replace them with, the things that we want. But at the same time, this is also the party that doesn't want to take that to its inevitable conclusion, which we're talking about, which, Congressman Gomer recognizes. It's that, you have to look at all the parts of society that have at some point been corrupted or tainted or have some kind of bad baggage. You can't really cancel all of them. You can only really work and learn from them. And we can have discussions about, certain statues and what to do with them and where to put them. But when you go on this giant crusade, eventually the crusade comes for you, because the bell will toll for all people in the end times anyway.
It's so true. So look, Sam Faddis, he is a writer for N magazine. I think he actually started the magazine. He's a former CIA analyst, very bright guy, and he writes in his article entitled "The Armed Wing of the Democrat Party," he writes, in April 1861, local and state authorities in Charleston, South Carolina, demanded federal authorities leave the city and hand over control to the federal facilities there. When the United States government refused, an assault was begun on Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. 159 years later, it's happening again, but this time in Portland, Oregon. Responding to the Department of Homeland Security's concerns about the out-of-control riots in Portland in general and the threats to federal property specifically, just like Fort Sumter, Mayor Ted Wheeler of Portland said earlier this month, "The best thing any federal officials can do is stay inside their building or leave Portland altogether." That was when then he echoed the governor echoed what had happened in the Civil War in Fort Sumter. Incredible article. It's really worth reading, but it goes right to what Gomer's saying, which is this cancel culture, right, is all a diversion from what this party was really about. And now this same party, their supporters are in the street rioting and basically saying, we want to separate ourselves from the rest of the United States, and we want to separate the United States from all of its history and then start all over again. It's Civil War talk.
Yeah, well, I think, will we have like an armed insurrection in the United States? Probably not. But I will say that, the inevitable path of polarization doesn't end anywhere good. There are a lot of existential issues that the United States will have to contend with, and if we can't get it together here, I don't know how we can contend with them out there.
That's a great point.
The ever-growing presence of China in foreign affairs is certainly, to me, the most concerning issue in the world right now. I mean, they're literally rounding up, Uyghurs and putting them in boxcars and shipping them to concentration camps and effectively committing genocide. And look.
And using them as slave labor in their own country.
Slave labor. And,
harvesting their organs.
And China wants to effectively turn upside down the international, international relations and the international system. And look, at home, there are definitely a lot of domestic issues that we have to contend with. It's one of the things that the current president ran on, that I think that got him elected, was that, at some point we do have to contend with a lot of these issues at home. But canceling everything, it doesn't help us, achieve a lot of these, solutions that we're looking for to bridge these issues. Taking down a monument in Chicago, or, committing arson at a federal building in Portland.
Trying to burn down federal buildings and federal property.
Doesn't fix issues in education, or fix issues in housing, or labor,
or get the economy going, or help people in their city when you're burning the stores where they used to work.
Yeah, and look, I think the United States effectively has to get through this era of polarization and get back to a place where we can contend with ideas and issues. But
we can only hope.
It's less than optimistic from somebody like me who sees what is happening, what's happened, and what could potentially happen with just the way people interact with each other generally.
It's true. I mean, we've gone from soft Civil War talk to also kind of soft Civil War actions by Antifa and BLM and others who are just trying to show up and look. There are probably 100 different reasons why people are in these cities rioting.
Yeah.
I'm sure of it. I'm sure there's not one common denominator that brings them together. Sometimes it's just pure lawlessness, and other times it's pure anger. Sometimes it's political motivation because they want to eliminate free speech, they want to eliminate the First Amendment. And sometimes it's just pure separatists. They want to destroy the United States and separate it from its history. But case in point, this particular podcast is called Cancel the Election, and Maxine Walters, is it Waters? Maxine Waters?
Maxine Waters?
Yeah. Sorry, I got that wrong. Maxine Waters says the president is using the military in cities, which he's not. He's not using the military.
No.
He's using
Federal
law enforcement, but she calls it the military in cities so that the president can practice so that when he loses, he'll be able to use the military to stay in power. And this is, we don't have a clip on this because, Maxine Waters, she's just a hack, right? But here's the problem. There is a constituency that she speaks to, and it's primarily, unfortunately, in her district, an overwhelmingly black constituency who looks to this United States congressman and reelects her time and again and thinks to themselves, well, that's probably possible. That's possible. That's what's really happening to the United States right now. The United States is collapsing and the economy is collapsing because President Trump is trying to turn us into a militarized society and he's not going to want to leave the office once he loses. This to me is so dangerous, and it's fomenting the kind of nonsense that's out in the street by the least educated among us who have no knowledge of history, no knowledge of our Constitution, but hear this stuff and are motivated to continue to burn and loot and God knows what else.
Yeah. So to contend with the whole issue here, which is that a lot of people, and I've heard this from a lot of different people, not just Maxine Waters, is that there's this growing talking point that comes in the news that Trump won't leave office. The election will come, and for whatever reason, he'll just decide that he's not leaving office, which to me is just, I don't know how that happens because, hypothetically, if Biden wins, November 4th happens, he gets sworn in, and then all Trump is at that point is just somebody sitting in somebody else's house. So, I don't know what happens, but, they make it under they say these things under the guise that, the military is going to swoop in and they're going to defend him. There's going to be a coup in this country. And it's,
if anything, aren't they projecting? Isn't that what they tried to do right after the election and during the 2016 election? Didn't they try to engage in a coup?
Well, they certainly weren't happy about the election. I'll say that much.
But ever since then, they've impeached him. They've tried to engage in nothing but coup-like behavior, but they're saying this guy wants to commit a coup during the next election when that's what they did.
Yeah, and the worst part is, I think you hit on something, is there's a lot of people who will hear that.
It happens.
And then they just take it as truth. They don't vet the talking point. They don't, vet the story or understand how the system works to know that, it's not possible what they're saying. It's illogical, but they'll take it as true. Then they'll go around and they'll say, well, Trump's a threat to this country, and that if he doesn't get reelected, he might not leave. And it's just, to me, it's
so let me ask you something about the millennials, their thought process on this. When millennials watch the looting and the burning and the rioting in these American cities, what do you see in terms of people? What is your opinion of it? What are millennials' opinion of it? Not conservative millennials, but just generally speaking millennials. What do they see?
Well, a lot of it is the media talking point that I heard when this all started, which is that, they took some King quotes about, riots being the voice of the unheard. And a lot of people seem to be, fine with it because it sounds good.
But Martin Luther King didn't believe in rioting.
No, because later in that same speech, he goes that, rioting is a deprivation to your cause and is anticlimactic and not self-serving in any way at all. But, to them, they see this and they think that, rioting in the face of injustice is a good thing because it helps, achieve their goal, and that, the system, because it's all about the system, it's not just about solutions or anything, it's about uprooting the system and replacing it with something new. It's an indictment on America as a philosophy and as a concept.
And that's what millennials see when they see a cause worth fighting for because they don't believe in the system.
Yes.
Which is just remarkable to me that they grew up in a society that gave them all these privileges, including the privilege to
do
protest
what they're
peacefully.
Doing, and apparently protest not peacefully, which hasn't had very much repercussions. I mean, if you look at a lot of the people who have been arrested, so there was uproar the other day because in Kentucky, a bunch of people protested in front of the Attorney General's house, an African-American man, and they were arrested to be removed from the property. They were charged with a felony, but then the charges were dismissed, which is generally how most of these things when it comes to protesting goes. You get arrested, they put you in prison for the night, and then they drop the charges to send you home.
Yeah.
And you can do that. You can protest in this country. You have free speech. You have the right to assemble. And to a lot of people, they take these rights as, they are civil rights, and I believe they're human rights, and that everybody, regardless of what country they live in, should have the right to do these things. But a lot of people here take it for granted, and that they don't realize many places around the world don't enjoy that freedom. Look at the way that, we sometimes when things get out of hand, our police tend to err on the side of caution, and disperse crowds. But you look at a place like France, another Western, bastion of society where people view them as, an upstanding European country, and they've had notorious incidences of protests over there in the last couple of years. The Yellow Jacket movement, which is something you should all look into and read about because it's quite fascinating what they're fighting for and what a lot of the governmental issues are, because, they're a very heavy-handed government over there in the affairs of the public, and the second a protest comes out, they're running in with water hoses and fire trucks and just shooting they don't even get the chance to protest.
Right.
So
and here the protest has long since crossed the line.
60 days of protests in Portland,
and they're not protests anymore. These are they started out as protests, but they very quickly turned into.
Name me another country that'll have 60 days of patience with.
Probably doesn't exist on the planet.
Think,
And here's why I'm asking, because Nancy Pelosi, we have a clip of Nancy Pelosi talking about the President of the United States and how he's sending these federal law enforcement-ish individuals to these cities. He's deploying them to protect federal property.
Yes.
And Nancy Pelosi calls them stormtroopers. We're going to talk about that in a moment.
Yes.
But I first wanted to ask you what you thought about them, what millennials thought about these individuals in the street. Nancy Pelosi, instead of addressing those individuals and trying to create a sense of calm, instead indicts federal law enforcement officials as stormtroopers. We're going to discuss that in a moment, but first, listen to the clip. Here it is.
The fact is, whether he knows it yet or not, he will be leaving. Just because he might not want to move out of the White House doesn't mean we won't have an inauguration ceremony to inaugurate a duly elected president of the United States. And I'm second in line to the presidency, and just last week I had my regular continuation of government briefing. This might interest you because I say to them, this is never going to happen. God willing, it never will. But there is a process. It has nothing to do with if the certain occupant of the White House doesn't feel like moving and has to be fumigated out of there, because the presidency
like he's a cockroach.
Is the presidency. It's not geography or location.
That is the language by Nancy Pelosi, and the stormtrooper thing's coming later, but that's her language.
This is about her, parroting the same point about that Waters made, that he won't
leave.
But you know what I'll say?
He won't leave.
I'll say, based on the quote you read versus what Nancy said, I will give Nancy a lot of credit in that she certainly knows how to pick her words, because a lot of that in there has very tropes to other things. I mean, she said, he would have to be fumigated out. Instigating that,
And
Trump
she said she's number 2 in line. She's not. The vice president is number 2. She's number 3. It's like Dr. Evil. I'm number 1. I'm number 1. Hi, I'm number 2. Actually, she's number 3, but she should be number 2 because okay, we won't go there. Go ahead.
But she basically she's calling Trump a bug, or a cockroach or a rat, something in the house.
How is that helpful to the civil debate? It's really not.
No,
because
again,
what she's saying is
point.
they're setting the stage for massive fraud by election by mail. You know what? I just met before this podcast. I met a guy that I work with, right, in my real job, my day-to-day job that pays the bills. And he said to me, he says, you know what? I have a bunch of agreements I was going to bring you today. He said, but something is really happening with the mail. We're having a lot of issues getting the mail in a timely manner, and sometimes it's not showing up at all. He said, and all the folks that are sending me these agreements are very reliable folks, so I don't know what's happening with the mail. That's the problem, guys, right? That's why you want to show up in person to vote,
Yeah.
and only vote by mail in the really extreme situations when you are concerned about your health, in which case,
Yeah.
I get it, then vote by mail. But she's setting this up. First of all, she's setting up the seeds of destruction of our country by saying, we're going to make everybody vote by mail. There's going to be massive vote fraud. Trump's not going to leave the White House. Well, maybe he isn't, because there's going to be so much vote fraud because you're cheating. Maybe that's what's going on.
You know, as a millennial, I think when it comes to things like vote by mail, I don't have an issue with expanded access. I think it's something that Republicans will have to contend with inevitably anyway, and that it isn't something that's strictly Democratic, or strictly Democrat advantaged. I mean, but there are instances where vote by mail has worked, notably the California special election where a Republican was recently elected. But then there's also a lot of glaring examples where it doesn't work. And my view on an election is that everybody should have the same, equality of opportunity to vote. And if you have areas where it works, but areas where it glaringly doesn't, then you can't make everybody use a one-size-fits-all policy. I mean, and that's how...
You also can't have endless voting. Here's the problem. Voting is supposed to occur on a date defined and end at a date and time defined.
Yeah.
And what the Democrats constantly try to do...
They want to keep expanding the window.
They want to blur the voting window so that, you can say, well, we know there was a problem with the post office, but this 100,000 ballots just showed up a week late, but we're going to count them anyway.
Yeah.
No,
or
that's
look,
the problem.
Or
there
they
has to
send
be a
the ballots.
time.
They send the ballots early. So I saw a chart today that was sent to me, and a couple people were discussing it, and it was which states that have So a lot of the battleground states, the key swing states per se, what people call them,
are controlled by Democrat governors.
But
Democratic
even then,
governors.
so
they're putting in massive vote by mail campaigns.
But their vote by mail dates start before there's going to be a presidential debate. So you're
Which
going to
is
have
stupid.
people who are going to vote without ever actually hearing the two candidates spar on the issue, which to me just seems illogical.
Without ever having heard Joe Biden answer any questions from critical thinking media. Instead, he just goes, right? I mean, it's just crazy. So Chuck Schumer is really, I'm glad you brought up the election part of it, because we're talking about canceling the election. Chuck Schumer is talking about, in this clip, he's talking about exactly the framework of what this election is about as defined by the Democrat Party. We have a clip on this, and we're going to discuss this, and here is the clip.
Police officers, any federal officers have to have ID, where they're from and what their name is, and more importantly, if they go off federal property itself and patrol streets or anything else, they have to get the permission of the executive in charge, the mayor or governor. That's how this should be done. President Trump always likes diversions. He's miserably failing at testing. He's miserably failing at contact tracing. He's miserably failing at getting the economy going. He's miserably failing on the greatest crisis America has, and the American people know. So he tries a diversion.
So those are all the Democrat talking points, and now the new Democrat talking point is, well, now that he's sending federal law enforcement out there, the President of the United States is, to try to bring order back to America's cities where Democrats are in control and refuse to do so, he's going to miserably fail at that too, and he shouldn't even send them in. Imagine that. You're actually saying, as one of the highest elected officials in the United States, the Senate Minority Leader, that you would rather see these cities burn than you would, and people's lives ruined, including their economic viability, rather than have federal officials go in there and bring order.
Yeah, to me, so we can debate, the effective way of doing that, but to me, I think it's astonishing that he's, referring to people's livelihoods and actions to kind of bring peace, regardless of how they may occur, as a diversion, as if somebody is simply, these actions are just, one way to scapegoat from the actual issues going on. But, there are a lot of issues, again, to contend with. And yes, sure, there's, things with the coronavirus that have to be dealt with and will inevitably be dealt with, as this virus continues. But, the anarchy and a lot of the rioting still have to be, contained. I mean, you can't just continue indefinitely.
Well, here's the thing. If the federal law enforcement officials weren't there in the courthouse grounds,
you probably would have taken it over.
Of a federal courthourse, it would have been burned.
Yeah, I mean, you've seen it with several of the police stations. And
it would have been ransacked and then burned.
Seattle and Minneapolis.
And what kind of signal are you then sending to
the federal government
American people?
You
can't allow that to happen.
Not in the federal government. Like, you can talk about ineptitude in state government and city government.
And you can allow the idiot.
But the federal government cannot appear weak.
Very true. So true.
Especially.
But that's what Schumer wants to see. That's the point here.
Life is easy to be
That's
Chuck
what
Schumer
he wants to
because
see.
you can get up there on stage and you can say anything you want. At the end of the day, there's nothing that'll impact Schumer's life because he has look, he may be important in politics, but he has no real power in the legislature. He's not accountable for any of the bills that are or aren't passed there because he's in the minority. And it's real easy to be in the minority because you can just sit there
Say
and
whatever you want.
poke and prod and have you don't have to find solutions.
And I'm
you don't
sure
even
that,
have to try.
by the way, Garrick, I'm sure the economy in Portland, Oregon isn't that great, right? Because they've shut down the economy due to coronavirus. People can't go to work, people can't open up their businesses, and so forth. And they keep making it more and more difficult for people to do so, including the so-called second wave. But what's interesting is that they can go and they can protest and be right next to each other yelling, but they can't actually go to work.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, what is wrong with these people? So Pelosi, this is where she talks about the stormtroopers. So first you had Schumer. By the way, they were both at the same press conference. First, Schumer talking about federal law enforcement.
They're best friends.
And how the President of the United States has failed at everything, and now he's going to fail at law enforcement in these cities and should even send people. And Nancy Pelosi then refers to she's number 3 in line, even though she said she's number 2, and she's undermining the authority of the federal government of the United States, including the people that are charged with enforcing its laws, the laws that she would make and has made for decades. We have Nancy Pelosi on this, and here is the clip.
It's very, very important. The use of stormtroopers under the guise of law and order is a tactic that is not appropriate to our country in any way.
What is a stormtrooper, first of all?
So, when I first heard this, I was a little astonished that she used stormtrooper because to a lot of people they would just see, when you hear stormtrooper and think of Star Wars, the little dudes in white suits
the guys in the white
who can't
suits.
shoot anything.
They always get shot,
and they can never hit anything.
There are 3,000 of them. They shoot, but Luke never gets shot by them, but they always do.
Yeah, but then I was thinking about it. I was like, that's probably not what she meant. What she was referring to is the stormtrooper of the 1930s.
Explain what that is.
The original goons of the Nazi Party. These are the people who were responsible for the Night of Long Knives and a lot of the violence that happened in Germany during the pre and early Nazi era, where Hitler was vying for power, and contending with the socialists and the communists for effective leadership, and these were the people who carried out those deeds. Violence against Jews, violence against the population.
And they
unrest.
wreaked havoc in the streets of Germany in order for and on behalf of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, so that he could rise to power. And what's interesting is that the people that are trying to achieve that particular goal are the Antifa folks, and many, not all, but many of the BLM folks who are themselves Marxists and are themselves anti-government and anti-anything. And they're the Jacobins, and they're in the streets basically wreaking havoc. And she's referring to the people that are trying to bring order back to the streets as the members of the Nazi Party?
Yeah, so I'm not going to refer to anybody as a Nazi. I think it brings,
It lessens the effects of what happened in World War II.
Yeah. But to me, the sitting, Speaker of the House referring to federal law enforcement agents and federal law enforcement programs that she herself created as Nazis, to me is astonishing. It's gross because these are people that you help fund, you create, you give them, you use oversight on them. To me, it's like she might as well be driving the bus over her own kids. That's basically what she's doing.
What's interesting too is this clip of Schumer and Pelosi, where she mentions stormtroopers. That clip was at a press conference. So in other words, by definition, at a press conference, the press was
Nobody
present.
asked her a question on it.
No one asked a question. You can tell that our free press has collapsed. It's not collapsing. It has collapsed in the United States.
It's unaccountable.
It's a very dangerous period of time in the United States.
Yeah.
And we know why it has collapsed. It's collapsed because there's no way to monetize the press anymore, to pay really good investigative journalists and intelligent people who've studied history.
There are only two newspapers.
You can't sell newspapers anymore.
Yeah, there's only two newspapers with real journalists in the United States right now in terms of
Wall Street Journal, and what's the other one?
Well, you're going to debate with me here, but there's only two actual investigative journalist newsrooms in the United States: the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. And I know we don't like, Mark doesn't like the New York Times.
New York Times is a fraction of itself.
But most
Wall
people
Street-
can't even afford to hire
I
journalists.
thought you were going to say the New York Post.
Nah,
So-
they're satire.
But you know what the thing is? The thing is the press is sitting there. Why wouldn't, and here's what I think. I actually think that most of the members of the press who were present don't even know what a stormtrooper is.
Probably
other
didn't
than-
even think twice.
They're
to
probably
comment.
thinking of Star Wars.
They're like, it's a funny allude to Star Wars.
They're
I was
thinking
like,
of Star
no,
Wars. That's
no.
how shallow these people are. Whereas literally, as short as 25 years ago, you would have had the investigative reporters who both, slightly right of center and slightly left of center going, wait a minute, you can't do that. Are you literally calling the federal government a Nazi
I think
party?
to me it was just astonishing that nobody asked. I mean, and nobody asked her a question about the authenticity of her argument that Trump wouldn't leave office. To me, because it's like anybody who worth
They're
their
projecting.
weight, anybody worth their weight in knowledge would think of that and go, it's unrealistic and it's an unfounded claim because people like to attribute that Trump doesn't want to leave the office, but I don't think I've ever heard him, say anything even remotely to that sense. And look, I'm very critical of him in a lot of respects, but I'll give him, the benefit of the doubt in that. Where is this coming from that people attribute this kind of sentiment to him?
It's because I think that the Democrat Party, and by the way, and this goes for the Republican Party too. Traditionally, they would be checked by the media.
Yeah,
First,
but the media is effectively shielded for one side.
But now what's left is they're being checked only by each other.
Yeah,
And there's no
and the media
third,
just
there's no
shills
third
for the
group.
Democratic Party. They're essentially an extension of them. I mean, look at the Tom Cotton op-ed that came out, in the New York Times.
Yeah, the New York Times that you say is one of the better
Well,
papers.
I just said they're the only ones with an investigative newsroom that they actually bother to hire journalists.
Yeah, but
but
they're
they
not
don't-
journalists.
but
They're
not.
activists.
Yeah,
They're activists.
yeah.
'cause
But
they-
this is also telling you the pipeline of what kinds of intellectuals join the news. It is typically
They're not even
people of liberal
intellectuals.
views. They come out and they want to.
An intellectual is a critical thinker who's willing to go to the side of truth or find truth and then report it, rather than start with a conclusion when they start the article. So,
Yeah, but so this is what Democratic and Republican Party has to contend with, where the Republican Party is consistently under siege by journalists who have no interest in reporting the news or being journalists, but rather pushing an agenda. And one that places like the New York Times will openly tell you they want to report the right news, not the news.
but you know what's interesting is we were just before the podcast listeners, we were just talking to Stephen, and he's not Mike, so he really, we can hear him, but we were talking to Stephen about the fact that the local newspaper in the region where I live
Went out of business.
has collapsed.
Yeah.
So we had two local newspapers in my county, and they were both very good. And one was certainly better than the other, but they were both, pretty good.
Yeah, they
And
covered local news.
25 years ago, they covered local news and did a great job. And then one went out of business because the other was bought by a very large conglomerate, ran it out of business, and then successfully decided to bring in stories that had nothing to do with the local news.
Yeah.
People then stopped buying it because they're like, wait a minute, I buy your paper to find out what's happening in our region and locally, and now you're telling me what's happening in other states. I don't care what's happening in other states.
This has also made it difficult for newspapers to stay around.
Obviously, online because it's free. So, obviously the newspaper they had to pay for. I'm not talking about just the print version, but the online version they had to pay for. So then as people started cutting subscriptions and as advertising has gone away on these traditional newspapers
because they
like
don't
the
drive
local
up
newspaper,
viewership, so people don't want to
they
advertise
couldn't
with them.
afford to pay anyone.
Yeah.
So therefore they would pay one reporter to do stories in like a dozen different counties where they had a
And then
dozen
just
different
slap
newspapers.
it together into one newspaper.
So now that paper is gone. It has collapsed. And so here's an example. So now we can have unbridled conversation by elected officials in my county and in nearby counties, whereby no one is held to account because there's no media to call them on it. So let's just say a politician from the other party calls someone on saying, you really shouldn't say that. You really shouldn't say that Republicans are Nazis or this group or that group is a Nazi because the Nazi party speaks for itself. There's no media to cover it. So the only way you can get that voice out there is through basically social media, and that's super limited as well because it's
to
it's
me,
not
it's
reliable.
just toxic. I mean, but
It's
besides,
toxic.
and everybody
Agreed.
has a voice. One of the things that I like about a newspaper and a bunch of people reading a newspaper is it is one clear and concise voice, and it's giving a perspective, and you read it and you either apply it or you don't apply it. But now, you can give your feelings in the comments section, but that doesn't override a story. But now, with social media, everybody has a voice, whether they're knowledgeable about a subject or not, and they can just go off their emotions.
So let me ask you something. As a millennial, if you were present at that press conference with Nancy Pelosi and she said stormtroopers,
I would have finally asked her.
And you're a reporter, you had a question, what would you ask?
I would say, are you insinuating that federal law enforcement troopers are Nazis?
And then, of course, Nancy Pelosi is very good at the brush off, like, you're not going to be here again because you're asking me a critical question. And then you had an opportunity to follow up because she poo-pooed your question. And then what would you have said?
I would have said, ma'am, you haven't contended with the question. Are you really going to insinuate that these federal law enforcement troopers are the same people who committed atrocities against Jews and the like?
Interesting. Yeah. No, it's what is missing right now, and it's a really dangerous period in the United States because of the fact that we don't have a really critical and free-thinking media that's willing to call out both sides when they say these terrible things. Speaking of which, AOC used profanity on the House floor in response to Congressman Yoho. Yeah, that's a name. Congressman Yoho, he's a Republican from Florida. He's a United States congressman from Florida. He apparently saw her, AOC, on the steps of the Capitol outside somewhere, and he confronted her because he's just sick of her policies that she puts in place. And by the way, this happens in elected politics where one elected official, sometimes from the same party, will go after another elected official.
Yeah, Mark, I've seen it a lot with you.
And they'll do it, outside the purview of the media, outside the purview of people listening or watching, because they want to have a conversation and they're upset and they just want to vent. And usually that argument leads to a better understanding because then the people are like, oh, okay, well, you know what? We should actually talk more and see if we can work on at least some things together. Well, Congressman Yoho apparently approached AOC and she was super triggered. And we'll explain this in a minute. This clip is a little long of AOC talking about it on the House floor because she was so triggered. She's not used to anyone ever asking her questions or questioning her policies. And we have the clip on this, and here it is.
About 2 days ago, I was walking up the steps of the Capitol when Representative Yoho suddenly turned a corner, and he was accompanied by Representative Roger Williams, and accosted me on the steps right here in front of our nation's Capitol. I was minding my own business, walking up the steps, and Representative Yoho put his finger in my face. He called me disgusting. He called me crazy. He called me out of my mind. And he called me dangerous. And then he took a few more steps, and after I had recognized his comments as rude, he walked away and said, "I'm rude. You're calling me rude." I took a few steps.
Yeah, so sorry about that. It was a long one, I know. But here's the thing. I'm sure it happened, and I'm sure that Representative Yoho did go after her in a verbal discussion that was very robust. Apparently, she said also in that clip that he, as the clip went on, that he apparently called her the B word. Obviously, that's uncalled for if that happened, totally uncalled for. And if he had just talked to her and discussed with her the differences that they have and so forth, then she has no business saying that he accosted her. Because I've had many robust discussions with elected officials.
Emphasis on robust.
including in public hearings, right? Where they're presenting their bills and they're not being accosted, they're being questioned.
They're being debated.
But Democrats aren't used to being questioned.
Yeah.
So Representative Yoho went on the House floor and he had a very impassioned speech where he did initially apologize for perhaps his demeanor. But here's the thing, if he did use the B word, clearly that shouldn't happen.
Then you're in the wrong, yeah.
It doesn't help in this climate that we have for elected officials.
Serves no purpose, really.
It really doesn't. They should discuss vigorously the issues and their bills, but not, to the point where they're putting fingers in each other's faces. It's really not helpful because it doesn't move the ball. Anyway, here is Representative Yoho, a clip of him on the House floor talking about the very same incident. Here it is.
This body, I rise to apologize for the abrupt manner of the conversation I had with my colleague from New York. It is true that we disagree on policies and visions for America, but that does not mean we should be disrespectful. Having been married for 45 years with 2 daughters, I'm very cognizant of my language. The offensive name-calling words attributed to me by the press were never spoken to my colleagues, and if they were construed that way, I apologize for their misunderstanding. As my colleagues know, I'm passionate about those affected by poverty. My wife Carolyn and I started out together at the age of 19 with nothing. We did odd jobs, and we were on food stamps. I know the face of poverty, and for a time it was mine. That is why I know people in this country can still, with all its faults, rise up and succeed and not be encouraged to break the law. I will commit to each of you that I will conduct myself from a place of passion and understanding, that policy and political disagreement be vigorously debated with the knowledge that we approach the problems facing our nation with the betterment of the country in mind and the people we serve. I cannot apologize for my passion or for loving my God, my family, and my country. I yield back.
So that's very good, right?
Pretty good speech.
It's
It was
very
moving.
good. So maybe so Mr. Millennial Garrick here, should he have just called her a Karen?
This is what I said not to do Wednesday. I said don't start running around and using Karen. Here we are. The cat is out of the
Would
bag.
that have been better? He said, so they had a disagreement, and she didn't like it. So I'm sure she can get very nasty, and apparently he did as well. And then the discussion escalated. At which point he called her the B word. So maybe a Karen would have been better.
So I have some thoughts here, and I think I'm going to contend with the boomer here in a little bit.
Let's hear it.
So obviously AOC is 20-something.
So by the way, Chris, that should be the title of this clip. It should be, is AOC a Karen?
Is AOC a Karen?
Go ahead.
Anyways.
Go ahead. Come
That's a-
on.
that's a good
Let's hear
one.
it.
That's a
Give
good
it to
one.
me. Give the boomer.
So Mr. Yoho, which is still the best name in Congress.
Congressman
concerned.
Yoho.
He's based on the mathematics. I'm going to guess he's 64, 65. Is it really worth it or even necessary to have that, disagreement on the steps of the Capitol as people are walking in both ways? One of the things that I think is increasingly lost on Congress is civility and grace and the ability to contend with each other on issues. And look, I am all for
Well said.
calling out AOC on her proverbial crap because, I don't think she's a very good congresswoman by any stretch.
Not very bright either. Yeah.
And I am all for Republicans emphasizing, that her policies are being taken as and used as a majority of policy platforms for, presidential elections, and they would have disastrous consequences on us. But I don't think, it's smart or even necessary to be walking up the stairs as she's walking down the stairs and, just confronting her there. There's a place for that, and it's called the House floor, where all this stuff happens and where it should stay. And I appreciate Mr. Yoho's passion.
Or in the hallways of Congress, it's perfectly normal to have a conversation and say, hey, AOC, I saw a bill that you put in. Come on, why would you put a bill in like that? Don't you think it's going to affect, my constituents, and just go down and talk about it that way as to why you disagree with the bill?
Yeah. Now, of course, there's a lot of things that we don't know. I don't know the extent of what the conversation looked like.
don't know.
Have media, perceptions. We have what AOC says about it. We have Mr. Yoho says about it. And, we can never really know.
But why are we talking about this on Mark and the Millennials? We're talking about it because this goes to the very issue that we're having in this country right now, which is the inability of people from different sides
to have a conversation.
Yes.
Yes.
And that's important, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's something that's really lacking throughout the country, and you got Nancy Pelosi calling federal officials stormtroopers,
It's just everything is so provocative. It's like, what is the best way to get people up in arms and be aggressive and
to get lots of social media likes and social media hits. You know, I mean, it seems to be that's the way it is.
Yeah, and that's one of the things. It's like, I can't speak to how I would have reacted to such a thing. I mean, I'm more of a, water off my back until I get into my office, and then I curse incessantly because that's just how I react to things. But like, I wouldn't have walked to the House floor and been like up in arms about I was accosted on the steps. I mean, people are going to people.
Absolutely.
So, but civility and grace is important, and Mr. Yoho should take a lesson in when is the appropriate time, but also, we should still continue to call AOC out on AOC things,
Absolutely. And you know what? I've had discussions like this myself with other elected officials, but also with activists.
Yeah.
And this segues us into the next section of BLM and some of the tactics that they've engaged in. But first, I was on my way to the state capitol one day, and this group of individuals were wearing windmills on their heads. Windmills. They were homemade windmills. And so they had this Reynolds wrap around their heads, and that's how they were able to connect the windmill to their head. And the wind was hitting the windmill, and it was turning, and they were like advocating for wind, right? And
Mark's a big nuclear guy, for anybody who doesn't know.
And it was not just offshore wind, but it was just wind turbines
wind in general.
everywhere,
Put them everywhere
and
anywhere. Yeah.
And so I said to the lady on the way to the Capitol, first she says to me, she goes, support the windmills, support the windmills. And I said, ma'am, you're missing one thing with your outfit. She goes, what's that? I said, a bunch of dead birds at your feet. So, that's the kind of conversation. I like to use humor, but humor has, of course, a lot of truth to it because that's what happens at these windmills. Well, BLM, they're now using children.
Yeah.
And this is another issue that's also happened here in Annapolis, where the teachers union, brought children. They bused them on public school buses, public school children, and gave them placards to protest for more funding. Yeah. Not because their particular school didn't have sufficient funding.
Or they'd march them into our office and be like, are you going to support funding money for me?
Yes.
Otherwise I'll go hungry.
And they're being told something that simply isn't so.
Yeah.
And so I'm really against this idea of using children for this purpose. Well, BLM is doing that exact thing. Specifically in Portland, Oregon, BLM is using children to hold signs that have profanity on the signs, and the profanity says F blank the police.
Yeah.
And the children are chanting the very same thing.
That's terrible.
Just disgusting.
I'm vehemently opposed to co-opting children for the purpose of politics, no matter what the issue. Even if they were getting children to advocate for something I'm passionate about, there's no place for it in that. One, these children are too young to understand what they're doing. They're too young to understand. They look like
they're 5 years old, 6 years old, 7 years old.
They're too young to have any opinion on what is going on or a comprehensive understanding of any issue at all.
It's unbelievable.
And children should be left to be children. They should be left to play, learn, grow, interact with each other, social stimulus, educational stimulus, interacting with their parents, their siblings, playing. Not put on the corner with signs and told to protest. I mean, to me, it's counterintuitive to how you should properly raise your children, because this is one of the things that I'll always talk about, and it's something that I've been quite passionate about, is that children nowadays view what is important to them drastically different than how your generation did. When you were a kid, people worried about what they were going to get on their test, what they were going to do after school, what they were going to eat.
They couldn't wait to go outside and play.
But now kids are, they're worried about world affairs. They're worried about the inevitable doom of climate change. They're worried about, getting into great colleges that, and sure, but this is my point. It's like, we're setting these...
They're being engaged in political issues that they have no business being engaged in because they're being brainwashed at a very early age. And they're being brainwashed in some cases by teachers' unions,
and it's not
like I mentioned earlier. In this particular case, by a BLM movement that is principally Marxist. Certainly, the leadership is Marxist. If you look at their website, it's a Marxist organization. Go ahead.
Yeah, to me, it's just I just think the kids should be left to be kids.
So very good. So podcast listeners, we actually have a video. So you have to mostly watch the video, but there is some audio there. Where if you listen closely, you'll hear one of these students, one of these kids, I'm not even sure if it's a student, it looks like they're 5 years old, 4 or 5 years old, say, F the police, and the parents saying, say F the police. Unbelievable. I'm sorry, this is society at its actual worst.
Yeah.
And this is
That's a future generation.
complete degradation of our society.
Yeah, you can do all the bad things in the world for all I care if it solely impacts you. But the second you start, putting this on other people and you start impacting other people's lives and an entire generation of people's
Ruining
lives,
them.
To me, it crosses a line of ethics.
You know who needs to, well said, do you know who needs to stand up? The black community needs to stand up and say, that is disgusting, that is wrong.
Yeah.
This is exactly what's wrong with our community, is that we're teaching children this instead of how to do a skill and getting an education.
Yeah.
This is not helpful, folks.
When your kids are teenagers or even young adults and they want to come protest with you and then they're passionate about that issue, that's one thing. But when they're 5, 4,
they have no idea what there is. They don't even know what the issue is. So we have this clip. Please watch it and listen very carefully. You'll hear it. Here is the clip.
Here they are. All right, watch out. All right.
Fuck the police.
What is it?
Fuck the police.
All right.
Fuck the police.
Say it. Can you do that? Everybody hearing this up,
Fuck the police.
Power to the people. Power to the people. Thanks, kids.
So there you go. So
thanks, kids. Like they did them a service.
Yes, yeah, thanks, kids. And that was, sadly, that was exclusively BLM members who happened to be black and their children, with black children, saying this, that they actually look like they're about 4 years old saying this. I've never seen anything so disgusting. And I just really wish this were covered more, not just by the media, but also if a really willing media went up to them and asked them questions.
Yeah, why is this?
Do you really think this is appropriate to put your children through this? Do you really think this is helpful?
Yeah.
Final thoughts on that.
I'm somebody who believes that everybody should be able to raise their kids in their own way. But, there's also science about how kids should learn and general ways that they should be taught. And this isn't one of them. And to me, it's terrible.
It is.
I can't express it enough how much, irregardless of the race of the children, they should just be left to be children. They shouldn't be, co-opted into some political activism that they don't understand and are being, influenced in a way that they have no way of being critical of.
So true. So next up, we have the dumbest bill in America. It's the dumbest bill in America. Do we have a lead up, Mr. Assistant Producer? Of course. Here it is.
Dum 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 dum.
And it's the dumbest bill in America, and of course it's from the state of California.
Oh.
What a surprise. And the state of California has decided that it is going to pass a bill to allow commercial tenants to terminate their leases early. So if you have a restaurant or a business or an office and you have a lease, California is going to say, well, if you have less than 500 employees, doesn't sound very small to me, we're going to allow you to terminate your lease early because of the pandemic. Folks, look, I get it.
I don't know how that works.
I get it. I understand that there are a lot of folks out there who can't open their businesses up because they're being told in California, because California has just shut down the economy again, and you can't, but they're making things worse because now the owner still has to pay the bank for the mortgage. Where's he going to get the money from?
Yeah, see, and this is what's weird to me is because when you talk about contract law, now I'm not a lawyer yet, but
you're going to law school. You play one on TV.
I play one on TV, yes, and I have a great mustache to go with it. Call me Tom Selleck. Anyways, when talking about a contract between a commercial space and a leasee, I don't understand how the government can just walk in one day and tell one party that their contract is effectively
getting in the middle of a
voidable.
contract.
Yeah, in the middle of because it's independent of the government and it's enforceable strictly by the court. And I don't understand how So
it's a great point.
To me, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that a third party
government caused the problem. Now government's making the problem even worse by causing foreclosures
and I just
people that own the
how that
property.
third party has any right to be involved.
They're collapsing the economy intentionally.
Yeah,
if
you think there's going to be issues with people staying afloat in terms of businesses, in these spaces, could you imagine the provider? How many? Well, Mark, that might be what they want. They might want a lot of these public buildings to go out and be able to seize them by the banks and buy them.
I think that California is doing this on purpose because the secret to getting back the House of Representatives is to flip those 7 seats that flipped in 2018, flipped to the Democrat Party, and they're trying to kill the economy in California so that Congress cannot go back to the Republican Party. And this is the way you do it. And look, here's the thing. When the government gets involved in these contracts, what it does is it eliminates the ability of people just to talk to one another. So let's just say you have a lease and you have a restaurant or you have a gym or whatever you have, and you've been hit really hard by this pandemic. You cannot pay your rent.
Yes.
What you would normally just call your landlord and say, hey, look, here's the thing. If I move out, there's nobody moving in, because there's not. There's nobody moving into the space because the economy is so bad and they can't open up anyway because the restaurant's closed or the gym is closed. So can we do a workout whereby we extend my lease for an additional 10 years and we add an additional $150 or $500 or whatever it is, or I pay it at the very end of the lease in 10 years.
Yeah.
Whatever they can we do a modification? That's what it's called, a lease modification. When the government gets in the middle of contracts, it eliminates the ability of people who are the ones who are in charge, good thinking people, to negotiate with one another to do a workout. And if you have a jerk for a landlord, you probably shouldn't have been leasing from them anyway, to be honest with you, because I get it, there are a lot of bad landlords, but California is going to make this situation much worse.
I can't even begin to think of what economic consequences there would be from just allowing people to void contracts.
Mandating the ability of a tenant to terminate its lease early. That's really what this is.
Yeah.
Final thoughts on this.
And a lease that you weren't, forced into signing. You did it voluntarily. You took stock of your business. You signed a lease based on your accounts receivable, and you live there and you work there.
Well, here's a workaround. Why doesn't government instead in California do a tax credit for people who have leases and they can't pay? So let's just say, hey, look, guys, here's the good news.
When you start making money,
when you open back up and you start making money, we're going to actually give you a tax credit for the value of your lease, so that you can pay your lease instead of paying the state. And we, the state, we're going to be the ones to take the hit because we're the ones that shut you down.
Well, Mark, California is on a revenue hunt right now, looking to
They always, just like every other woke state, woke blue state.
Yeah.
So that's the final word for Mark and the Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our millennial, Garrick Ross, and Stephen Miller for joining us, of course.
Our in-house audience.
And of course, Adam Couture, our producer, and our assistant producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and our website. See you next time.